Our first speaker today is David Farber, who is the Roy Roberts Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Kansas. David was educated at the University of Michigan and the University of Chicago. He has taught at Temple University, the University of New Mexico, Barnard College, and the University of Hawaii. He has also held teaching fellowships in Tokyo, in Lyon, France, in Beirut, Melbourne, and Jakarta, as well as fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies and the American Library Association. He's the author or co-author or editor of more than 10 books, most of which examine the 20th century, especially the second half of the century, including Everybody Ought to Be Rich, The Life and Times of John J. Raskob, Capitalists, The Rise and Fall of Modern American Conservatism, Taken Hostage, The Iran Hostage Crisis, Sloan Rules, Alfred P. Sloan and the Triumph of General Motors, a book which received the Herbert Hoover Prize for the best book on any topic in American history. David is currently working on Crack, History for Cambridge University Press, a reflection of his longtime interest in drugs. That's a joke.
60s historian.
He's actually written on 60s and drugs, and I've used it in my classes, so thank you, David. For our purposes today, however, many of his books provide a necessary historical perspective on the theme of this conference, the Age of Great Dreams, America in the 1960s, the conservative 60s, the 60s from memory to history, and his very important first book, Chicago 68. David?
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much.
If you want, David, too.
Thanks for the technical support of the Loyola University.
If you want to do a handheld, David, there's this as well.
This will work either way.
Okay, good.
Thank you. So I'm looking around. I see a few people with gray hair besides myself up here. I was 11 when the 1968 Democratic Convention took place in Chicago. And I think part of the reason I wrote my first book about Chicago 68 was because I was trying to figure out what in the heck happened in Chicago and in the United States in 1968. And I'm supposed to be a writer, so I hate to resort to cliches, but two cliches really do come to mind when you think about Chicago in 1968. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and it was a tale of two cities. And I'll just briefly try to give you a sense as a way for us to start thinking about 1968 and the meaning of 1968, I think, for our contemporary thoughts, by just reminding you of a few things. In January 1968, Chicago seemed to be an exemplar of what good governance could be, what good public policy could be, how to make democratic politics, little d, but maybe also big D, work in a major urban city. Chicago was often compared to New York City. New York City in 1968 was falling apart. It had had a long strike. There was garbage piled up everywhere in the streets of New York City. And not to make a nod toward our fascist friend Il Duce, because fascism is a word we want to avoid in 2018, but Chicago was the city that worked. Our garbage got picked up in the city of Chicago. Things were in order in the city of Chicago. And in 1968, Chicago also seemed to be working on what was the most contentious and most problematic issue in the United States, the question of race in the United States. By January 1968, most big cities in the United States, especially in the North and the Midwest, had gone through major conflagrations, racial uprisings, riots, rebellions, whatever word you want to use, and the politics of which word you choose was very viable in 1968. Chicago hadn't really had that kind of uprising. And the first Mayor Daley, we might get the third Mayor Daley, is that possible now? Bill's thinking about running. But at any rate, the first Mayor Daley was very proud of the fact that in Chicago, race relations, from his perspective, were good, were working. And compared to New York, the city was working. And in some ways it was. Unemployment among African Americans in 1968 was among the lowest of any big city in the United States. The employment rate for African Americans in Chicago at that time was close to 70% in poor inner city neighborhoods. That's an extraordinary number. It's probably 40% today, some number like that. The working class in Chicago had, Nelson maybe will talk about this, had tremendous union density. It was a city where wages were good, where prosperity seemed apparent, where the working class had a piece of the American pie at that point. The best of times, from some perspectives. Well, by December 1968, it looked quite different. And perhaps most catastrophic was what happened not in August 1968, when there were protests in the city of Chicago against the war in Vietnam and against the possibility of another pro-war Democrat being nominated, but in April of 1968. Some of you perhaps remember what happened in April 1968. Martin Luther King, of course, was assassinated in Memphis. And here in Chicago, at first, people weren't sure what to do, what to make of this. It's really a terribly tragic story. A lot of the public school children in the city of Chicago just spontaneously left the schools and trying to somehow assuage their grief or to memorialize what had happened, began marching down streets in the west side of Chicago. And unfortunately, that led, within about 24 hours' time, to a catastrophic race riot in the city of Chicago. And the city's west side, around West Madison Street, was on fire. Some neighborhoods on the south side, Woodlawn, also saw major rioting during that period of time. So Chicago, a city that seemed to work, clearly wasn't really working for everyone once you got beneath the surface. And the question of how race really worked in Chicago would become one of the focal points of that year in our politics. So that's one major event. The second major public event, of course, then does occur in August of 1968. And this was a very different kind of event because it was really, in some ways, a meeting of the local and the national. And again, if you think about the 1960s, and maybe if you think about politics in 2018 as well, there's always a kind of tension between the situating of a demonstration or a protest or an attempt to exercise democratic rights, which always occur at a specific place, and then the national context in which they occur. So the protests that took place in August 1968 over the Democratic Convention that was taking place were not meant to really be local in nature. They weren't aimed at Mayor Daley. They weren't aimed at the racial politics of the city of Chicago. They overwhelmingly were aimed at the war policy of the United States. Most of the protesters who came, arguably almost all of them, were focused on trying to somehow convince the Democratic Party to accept an anti-war peace plank in their convention principles, to plausibly, though by August it seemed extraordinarily unlikely, nominate an anti-war candidate, and then for those more committed to a more radical politics, simply to witness their anger, their disapproval, their frustration with America's policy in Vietnam. So a national protest was cited locally. And when we think about democratic politics, little d democratic politics, I think Chicago is a really interesting example that should still kind of shade how we think about the politics of protest and demonstrations. From the perspective of Mayor Daley, I think it's fair to say from the perspective of those who thought themselves charged with keeping law and order in the city of Chicago, the police department, the protests were not about national issues. They were about who controls the streets and the sidewalks of the city of Chicago, who keeps order in the city of Chicago. What does orderly protest look like to the citizens of the city of Chicago? And their vision of local order was very different from that of those who thought they came here to exercise their constitutional rights of free speech and freedom of assembly, who thought they had the right to create a national protest around the Democratic National Convention. Well, I won't beleaguer what happened in Chicago in August of 1968, but I think it's fair to say, based on a commission that was created, a national commission, that the police rioted. So if we had an African-American uprising in April representing the hopes for perhaps real progressive radical change that would create a greater equity and equality in the United States on racial lines, in August we had the backlash, which was the hope to maintain an orderly, legally straightforward, if not hidebound, system in the city of Chicago and perhaps nationally. So you've got two different kinds of riots occurring in the city of Chicago that the whole nation is wrestling with. The riots in April were national. It wasn't just Chicago that had a riot over racial equity issues. Those riots broke out in most every major city and many small towns in the United States. The riot in August was a different kind. It was seen by people all over the United States. The politics of protest in Chicago set the stage for how many people thought about politics in 1968, and I'd argue how they thought about little d democratic politics more fully. There were those who saw the April riot as portending the possibility of real radical change. And much more quietly, there were people in the city of Chicago who tried to use the anger and the frustration, the rage, that April riot showed to do something that had really never been done in Chicago before and probably, arguably, hadn't been done in any city before that time. There was a young 19-year-old black man from the south side of Chicago named Fred Hampton. And he had recently gotten involved, I hope I'm not stepping on your toes over here, he had recently gotten involved with the Black Panther Party, which had started in Oakland, California, 2.5 years earlier. And Fred Hampton did something rather extraordinary. He reached out to the largest street gang in the city of Chicago, which at that time was still called the Blackstone Rangers, eventually the Peace Stone Nation, or the O'Rourkens. It's gone through several iterations. And he tried to figure out how you could radicalize young street youth. It didn't work, obviously. The Peace Stone Nation had other ways to make a living, and they decided that the Black Panthers did not represent the best path forward for them. Eventually, they'd become the major drug dealers alongside the gangster disciples in the city of Chicago. But Hampton had tried something really amazing. That failed. He then tried another thing, which I think is equally amazing. It also failed. He reached out to two other street gangs in the city of Chicago. He reached out to the Young Lords, which was a Puerto Rican gang, mostly south of here in the Lakeview area of the city of Chicago. And he reached out, again, to a gang not too far from here in the Uptown area called the Young Patriots, which was an all-white gang, mostly people from Appalachia who'd settled here in the 40s and 50s, and their kids were coming of age during that period of time. Hampton, working with the leadership of the Young Lords and the leadership of the Young Patriots, created what he called the Rainbow Coalition. It would become much more famous a few years later when Jesse Jackson, who knew about this original Rainbow Coalition, used the name for a national attempt to do the same. It was hard to do. The Young Patriots used the Confederate flag as their emblem. That was a little bit hard for Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers to swallow, but they mostly did. They accepted it. The politics of race and ethnicity in the United States made that a very unlikely combination to move forward. The police department of the city of Chicago did not care for this attempted alliance either and did everything in their power to break it apart. That was the quiet politics of 1968. It didn't really go that far, would be my argument. Although, anybody know who the congressman from the 1st District of the proud city of Chicago is? A guy named Bobby Rush, who came out of that Black Panther Party and who came out of that Rainbow Coalition attempt in 1968 and 69. So there was some movement. I'll end, what time is it?
Actually, you have 10 minutes.
I got 10 minutes, all right. I will continue to talk now at more length about the other kind of politics that came out of the August 1968 protests. First of all, understand that at a national level, that politics of Chicago, that confrontation between a local set of officials, Mayor Daley and his police, and a national set of protesters, National Mobilization and the War in Vietnam, the Yippies, if that name means anything to any of you, was disastrous, I would argue, for the left and for the anti-war movement, at least in the short term. Overwhelmingly, people who watched that riot, what I call the police riot, what the National Commission to investigate the violence that occurred called a police riot, was seen by most Americans as a sign that there was too much disorder in the United States, that there was too much protest, there were too many people in the streets, there was too much open participatory use of the First Amendment in the United States, and that the police and Mayor Daley were right to shut it down with vengeance. Most white Americans, when polled about this, said the police not only did the right thing, but they did not use enough force in ending the protests in the city of Chicago. Richard Nixon heard that. He'd already talked in his own his own acceptance speech at the Republican convention 3 weeks earlier, that the first right of every American is the right to domestic tranquility. I don't remember that in the Constitution, but the right to domestic tranquility, order, that America needed order. So in some senses, that protest, at least to the degree that progressives thought that this would energize the left in the United States, would potentially radicalize more Americans in the United States, would show more Americans that the forces of law and order that crushed protesters' heads in Chicago was the same force that was creating violence in Vietnam. You can make a pretty good case that that backfired. It did not work. But here's the irony. If at a national level it didn't work, at a local level it actually did. So it's the opposite of what you might think. This national protest doesn't really do what it was intended to do, which is leverage more frustration with the war in Vietnam. It's a young guy named Bill Singer. I think he was about 26 or 27 years old at that time, a young lawyer. He just settled in the Lincoln Park area. He'd actually been a part of the anti-war protests, so he had a political background already. He looked around and he realized, I think we can organize around some of these issues. And in 1968, starting in September and October of 1968, working with some people who already were in the neighborhoods, a group called the Independent Precinct Organization, the IPO, an anti-Daley Democratic Party began to organize. And those Lakefront liberals, as they were called, won the 43rd Ward aldermanship. They won the 44th Ward aldermanship. They were anti-Daley Democrats. These white liberals would eventually form another kind of rainbow coalition, a much more pragmatic, much more liberal, not left or radical, coalition. It took 15 years, but this coalition between these lakefront folks, these anti-Daley Democrats, and black organizers in the South and West Side are what creates the Harold Washington Coalition. Now, Harold Washington did not win a lot of white votes, you'd be shocked to learn, in 1983. But he took the 43rd Ward. He almost took the 44th Ward. He almost took the 46th Ward, which is close to here. So it took a long time. It took steady organizing. It took patience. But that coalition actually worked over time. I might add that another force that I talked about earlier, I said there was a coalition between the Panthers, the Young Lords, and the Young Patriots. That middle part, that Puerto Rican part, also played a role in Harold Washington's campaign. In the 26th Ward, you got to know your politics if you're going to be a good Chicagoan, which is a West District around, I guess now it's a fancy neighborhood. What's it called where all the young hipsters go? I'm blanking. No, it's not the West. The 26th Ward is more like Ukraine Village and over that area and a little bit actually. Yeah, Wicker Park. Thanks, Wicker Park. A guy named Luis Gutierrez, who had been a young radical in 1968, decided that the Bill Singers and the Harold Washingtons were right, and he ran for office as committeeman. So you get a funny kind of mirror image on the pragmatic electoral politics side of this from 1968 to 1983 that mirrored the radical attempt at the same period of time. And there's also a lot of black organizing. There's a lot of black municipal workers who become critical to that campaign, but I didn't want to step on the toes, perhaps, of my colleague over here. What 1968 represented then are two things. One, the thing we kind of know. There was a radical set of uprisings in the city of Chicago that mirrored what was happening all over the United States. There were riots, there were rebellions, there were violent confrontations. And I think those politicized people in new and important ways. They made people think about politics in a way they never had before. And the city of Chicago was a prism through much of that happened. But much more quietly, and I'd argue in longer terms more significantly, people began to organize in new ways that they never had before, and they found alliances with people that they'd never known they could work together with before. So the politics of 68 on the one hand produced Richard Nixon. They also produced Harold Washington. So at the local level, at the municipal level, at the city level in particular, not just Chicago, but in cities around the country, you see these same kind of coalitions forming. So while radical politics in some ways turns out to be, I'd argue, a kind of dead end in some sense, a revolutionary, violent politics, this pragmatic, I'd say equally radical politics is actually quite successful coming out of 1968. So those are the two faces of Chicago. One a very public face that everybody watched on TV, and one a much more quiet set of activities that were taking place in rooms like this, where people sat around and tried to think, what can we actually do? What can we do to make a change? How do we work together across racial, ethnic, and even class lines? And there's a kind of happy story of Chicago 1968, which is not the one I told in my book, which I still urge you to buy. Thank you very much.
Very good. Great.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker is Nelson Lichtenstein, the Distinguished Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he directs the Center for the Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy. Nelson was educated at Dartmouth and Berkeley, and for a time worked in publishing in New York before going on to teach at Catholic University in Washington, the University of Virginia, and now UCSB. He's held numerous fellowships, including those from the NEH, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Guggenheim Foundation. He's the author or editor of about 16 books, including a highly regarded biography of the labor leader Walter Reuther, which I confess I shamelessly steal from my lectures, and State of the Union, A Century of American Labor. He's served on the editorial board of numerous journals and is now a member of the editorial board at the University of Illinois Press series on working class history. And many of his books, too numerous to name here, are ones that you can see from the titles that provide a necessary historical perspective to contemporary issues, such as Achieving Workers' Rights in the Global Economy, the Port Huron Statement, Sources and Legacies of the New Left's Founding Manifesto, the ILO from Geneva to the Pacific Rim, the Retail Revolution, How Walmart Created a Brave New World of Business, The Right and Labor in America, Politics, Ideology, and Imagination, which he co-edited with our own Ellie Schirmer, A Contest of Ideas, Capital and Politics and Labor, and American Capitalism, Social Thought and Political Economy in the 20th Century. In 2008, he was elected to the Society of American Historians, and in 2012, the Sidney Hillman Foundation awarded him the Sol Stetton Award for Lifetime Achievement in Labor History. Nelson?
Well, thank you. Yeah, thanks. Oh, good. Just while getting set, I just want to say, Ellie and I worked together at Santa Barbara, and she was really the co-founder of the center we've had for many, many years now going on. So I'm delighted that she's here and she's carrying on some of what we did there. Okay, there. So, I'm delighted that David gave this, great pointed study of Chicago, and then, of course, how that works with the world, and it all comes down sometimes to the district, to the neighborhood. And what I'm going to talk about today is something actually that is not talked about very much, which is what did the new leftists, and mainly the white new left, maybe the kind of what you think of as a white new left student type, age 22 or something. What did they think that their class was? What was their conception of it? Both all during the 60s and after. Let's see. Do I go to the? Yeah, there it is. So here's what I'm not going to talk about. Well, I'll show you what I'm not going to talk about first. I'll show you that. Then I'll talk about this is basically the outline of the whole talk. New leftists as middle class moralists, a disillusionment with the traditional working class in the 1960s. I was among not just among 22-year-old white students, but lots of people. The idea that they were a professional managerial class, not in a conservative way, but in a more radical way. And in the 70s, there's this interesting moment we've totally forgotten, a kind of Indian summer of militancy in which many people who'd been in the New Left joined factories, and many factory workers, I'll get to this, in effect take on some of the aspects of the New Left. Then part of the, really what our culture wars, the beginnings of them, I think they come out of this moment in which some conservatives also were playing around with what is the class of all these students. And then I'll talk about how its relationship to today. So now here, this is what I'm not going to talk about. When you think about the word class and the 60s, this is what you think about. You know, white workers kind of angry, getting pissed off, and maybe in Chicago they were the police, you know, and in New York a year later or 2 years later they were the hard hats. And we think of that. I mean, that's really, you know, that these students got people riled up, and, you know, they had, this is 1970, hard hats in New York City attacking anti-war demonstrators. We think of that, and you know, there's much to be said about that, and you can trace the history, whether it's Nixon or other conservatives or even Trump. You know, this has a lineage going back 50 years. I'm purposely not going to talk about that today. I want to talk about something different, which I think also has a lineage and is important. I'm also not going to talk about this guy, who's the labor leader, head of the entire AFL-CIO, George Meany. You know, he's smoking a cigar, looking like, you know, conservative. He once said, at least of male New Leftists, he said, they look like Jane and they smell like a John. You know, I mean, he was very, you know, and he was anti-gay and you know, many things to say that George Meany. I could go on about him, and he didn't like he was in Chicago. He was on the side of Daley, and he ended up by 72 supporting really Nixon for president, and that was official labor. And anyway, but some of you know that I mean, I would just say that if the formal political positions of the American labor movement in the 1960s were more conservative than at any other time really in the 20th century, before or afterward. Today, the American labor movement has moved to the left, but in this particular moment, and I'll get to that, they were seen to be quite conservative. So here is an early 1960s manifesto of the Students for a Democratic Society. That was one of the main institutions of the New Left, a volunteer group, called the Port Huron Statement. It was actually a meeting was held in Port Huron, Michigan, which was actually a summer camp for unionists. And in the it's come down to us as famous because it's in this statement written by Tom Hayden, who died recently. The famous he was in Chicago. He was leading the demonstrations in Grant Park. It's come down to us as the statement where the word participatory democracy is first used. But the very first line of the Port Huron Statement announces the class position of the people who wrote it, the New Left, the early New Left. And it says, we are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit. That's the very first line. We're people, at least in modest comfort. That's what they say. Middle class, in other words. But there's a problem. The fact that each individual sees apathy in his fellows perpetuates the common reluctance to organize for change. We are a materially improved society, and by our own improvements, we seem to have weakened the case for further change. This is actually, what they're saying is, American capitalism works. And it's true, it had worked. The standard of living was doubling in this period. We are, the products of that. We're middle class. We're in universities. But there's something morally lacking. There's injustice. Obviously, the civil rights problems and movement. That was the key thing. And all the leaders of the SDS, early SDS, were completely engaged with the civil rights movement. But more than that, there's a kind of hollowness at the center of this prosperous American society. That's something quite different than today. When capitalism seems to be having some problems of various sorts. But that's what they said. The problem was one of justice and liberation, and they were trying to figure out how do we get a new level of engagement. And they spoke to something. They spoke to that sense, a very strong sense of moral imperative that they felt. Now, oh, by the way, and of course, here they are. This actually, as you can see, I mean, you know, they not hippies. This is the early '60s. These are the people. They were, you know, you can see they're sort of wearing white shirts. They have, some of them have their left hands raised, some their right hands. They don't quite know. Anyway, there they are. You know, they're okay. I won't. This is Tom Hayden actually way over there. You probably heard of him. Okay, so next moment, Mario Savio, the 22-year-old leader of the free speech movement at Berkeley. He was he'd also actually been raised in a very in a Catholic world. He had a sense of internal sense of his own necessity to project himself in a moral and righteous fashion. He'd gone to Mississippi, civil rights work, and here he is at Berkeley, and he says he's speaking to one of the big rallies there. I think this is the rally just before many students occupied the main administration building where they got arrested. You know, he's saying, well, yes, he also understood that these were middle-class students housed in universities, but they weren't being treated like the middle class. At one point, he says, we have an autocracy which runs this university. It is managed by a board of directors, the regents. He said, well, I ask you to consider if this is a firm, and if the board of regents are the board of directors, and if there's a president, in that case was Clark Kerr, famous educator, is in fact the manager, then I tell you something, the faculty are a bunch of employees, and we're the raw material. But we're a bunch of raw materials that don't mean to be made into any product. We aren't we aren't going to be Charlie Chaplin on the assembly line. You know, he says that, and then very famously in his, I think everyone's heard a snippet of this speech. The rest of the speech, he says, "There's a time when the operation of the machine makes you becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part, and you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels and upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop." So there's a sense, okay, we are a middle class, but we're being manipulated. We're being, well, he wouldn't use the word exploited, but we are. But further, the other thing that Mario Savio says, and many other student leaders of the mid-'60s and the late '60s, is they did have an investment in the university. They saw the university as a place of enlightenment, of discussion, of interchange, and they thought it was being subverted not by themselves, but by the administrators, by the businessmen who were on the boards of regions and things of that sort. And their task was to recapture the university for its original purposes. I think in that sense. And so in the Vietnam War, one of the very first actions in the anti-Vietnam War movement were teach-ins, which the predicate of a teach-in was discussion, learning, the truth will come out, and then we can act on that. That was one of the things that happened. Now, at this same time, of course, the American labor movement seems to be quite conservative. Yes, there were many strikes, and the unions were in favor of liberal legislation and things of that sort. But certainly the sense of radical transformation, which might have been present in 1919 or 1937, is not there anymore. And there's a sense that if you're going to, as the '60s moved on, and whether this was utterly romantic or a kind of realistic way to think about things, as people began to talk about how do we have really radical change in this society? How do we revolutionize things we hate? For 100 years, more than 100 years, the answer had been, well, the working class. That's the lever of change in the world, And one could still see that in various moments in the post-war period in various countries in the world. But, in the United States, this seemed to be certainly not the case, and certainly became increasingly, it seemed, not the case as the leadership of the unions, and then, of course, white hard hat construction workers beating up anti-war demonstrators at various places, beginning really in 68, 69, 70. So, what is the working class, is failing to do its duty, as it were, its historical duty. Some people call this the labor metaphysic, the idea that labor movement was the center, was the lever of change historically, but now should we abandon the labor metaphysic? What should we do? Many people thought, well, affluence, prosperity, stability. That had really put as one participant in the free speech movements put it, the events in Berkeley should be an impetus to American radicals to finally kick the labor metaphysic and drop the vulgar Marxist belief that men must be hungry or unemployed or discriminated against to participate in radical political action. In other words, students from comfortable families could be radicals as well and should not be ashamed of that, Here are two intellectuals who are very influential with the New Left, with students. One is the older fellow, Herbert Marcuzza, and C. Wright Mills. The Mills, and start with Mills, the younger guy. He died untimely death in 1962, but his influence became only greater as the 60s went on. He wrote famous books like The Power Elite and Listen, Yankee, which was a book about Cuba. He bemoaned the co-optation of the old industrial working class and the powerlessness and atomization of the white-collar workers populating the corporate offices and government bureaucracies. In a famous book called White Collar, he basically thought white-collar workers might be kind of the fodder for a new American fascism. Herbert Marcuzza, an emigre from Germany, part of the famous Frankfurt School there, who incorporated Freudian sort of ideas about desire and want and radicalism and conservatism, and he thought that American workers, because of affluence, had become really just seduced by consumption. They'd lost their radical edge. He wrote a famous book called One-Dimensional Man, which I can remember, which was a kind of a, he'd been writing it for several years. It came out in the late 60s, I think 65 or 66, and it was basically saying, radicals, wherever you are in the world, don't look to the working class because that is over. That labor metaphysic is gone. I remember walking into the Berkeley bookstore. I think it was must have been, it might have been the spring of '68 actually, and there was this stack of Marcusa's books. I mean, it was like 1,000 books. I mean, obviously, it had been assigned in Sociology 101, but it was the New Left is absorbing this idea and these ideas. Carl Oglesby, a leader of SDS, he says, in view of the doctrine that the revolution is to be made by the army of industrial labor, how does the new radical dare to proceed in the conspicuous absence of that army? Does the white middle class New Left constitute the embryonic beginnings of a class for itself? Is the New Left actually a class for itself? Well, this woman, Barbara Ehrenreich, some of you know, she wrote Nickel and Dime. She's sort of a very prominent writer. She's all over the place today. Well, she was a young New Leftist back then. And she wrote in the journal Radical America, there's actually, with her husband, whose name was John, they wrote an essay, The New Left, the Professional Managerial Class Radicalism. The New Left, Professional Managerial Class Radicalism. And it appears, they've been thinking about this. It appeared in the 1976 issue, but they've been thinking about this for a while, and other people had as well. And they wrote, advanced capitalist society generates a new class, not found in earlier stages of capitalist development. The professional managerial class consists of salaried mental workers who do not own the means of production and whose major function in the social division of labor may be described broadly as the reproduction of capitalist culture and capitalist class relations. The professional managerial class includes scientists, engineers, teachers, social workers, writers, lower-level managers, etc. 25% of the entire working population. This new class is exploited, but it's also in conflict with the traditional working class. These students, professionals, wanted to reform or overthrow capitalism, but according to the Ehrenreichs, the new leftists often mixed hostility toward those above them with elitism and condescension toward the traditional working class below them. So they were pointing this out. Now, let's see. Well, here they are. Here's some right there. You know, doctors and nurses, obviously, and healthcare is booming. This is a booming sector. Steel mills might be falling down, but healthcare is booming. And they saw, and again, the university, which the early New Leftists had seen as kind of a bosom of possible rational thought that should be recaptured from the administrators. The professional managerial class, now that entering the professoriate, they also saw this as the university, the hospital, the bureaucracies of that sort as their turf. Their turf. As the Port Huron statement itself had said, any new left in America must in large measure be a left with real intellectual skills, committed to deliberativeness, honesty, reflection as working tools. Okay, so of course here, teaching assistant, I mean, the question was posed even then, is this the new class, of managers and professionals, or is this just a proletarianized, a debased middle-class person now working for peanuts? We have that problem. What would happen, I think, is 2 or 3 things in this period, 68 to the early 70s. First, this was the period when every single institution of this kind of knowledge-producing world, universities, hospitals, even advertising, newspapers, advertising agencies, Hollywood studios, had a radical caucus. Every single one. The historians did, the sociologists did, doctors did, engineers did. It was all over the place. A kind of, radicals in the professions. This was often called, the Maoists called this the long march through the institutions. This is the way the left would take over. Okay, here's one, earn big money, become a historian of a kind of box there. And here's one, the Radical Political Economics Review. There was just a lot of them. Okay, I had this funny, I don't know, just read this. Forget this guy's picture, read this. All right, okay, that's sort of, and not a very good joke, but okay. So the pro bono radical clinics, pro bono. So this is the period of this, and this will have a profound impact on universities, on hospitals, on all those institutions. There's a kind of a little bit of a democratization that takes place, a sense of what is the purpose of all this. But at the same time, I get this. At the same time, I don't want to look at him. At the same time. That's happening. There is also the doctors, teachers, lawyers. There is this proletarianization taking place. That is a beginning of an erosion in their high status. The old middle class, ministers, doctors, professors, hair doctor, professor, that it's eroding, and in big institutions they're becoming workers. And it's at this period that the New Left itself, around 1969 and 70, takes what it calls the turn to the working class. And thousands of new leftists, white, I'm talking about basically white, students, African Americans to some extent, mainly white students, they take jobs in steel mills and trucking warehouses and auto plants and coal mines, and they want to become part of the working class. And this had happened in earlier generations in actually the early 20s and the 1948, and then now in the 1960s. It's probably more than 10,000 new leftists did that. And at the same time that's happening, there's a kind of Indian summer of militancy, of strikes, of activity in the traditional working class in the United States. Obviously, many of you probably know the African American workers drummed Dodge Revolutionary Union movement. That was Detroit, but it had people in Chicago. They were, inspired by black black power and black militancy. They were active in the auto plants and some of the steel plants of the old steel belt. Here is the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Maybe you'll mention that. They were very active, but for our purposes, I mean, that had a kind of lineage through black power to the civil rights era to the riots. But for our purposes, in terms of the white New Left, there was a post office strike, forgotten, a illegal wildcat strike of 300,000 workers all across the country in the spring of 1970. Yes, there were post office workers were underpaid, but it didn't just happen. It was, in part inspired by what the New Left was doing. Lordstown became, I don't know if that name is familiar. Lordstown was a General Motors assembly plant in Ohio, entirely white almost. The average age of the workers were less than 30. They had a strike. Actually, it was a legal strike, but it became kind of the sense that finally, where did the 60s go? Well, in the 1970s, the 60s got down to the working class. I mean, it's in the 1970s that blue collar workers start getting ponytails and dressing, like 60s radicals to some extent, and so there's this sort of this merger of a kind of proletarianized New Left wannabe professionals with traditional blue collar working class people. And this receives like official recognition, as it were, governmental recognition, when the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, how's my time doing? Okay, fine. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, then under the leadership of Elliot Richardson, I guess he's a good guy, he resigned, during Watergate, But anyway, under the leadership of Elliot Richardson, they put out a report called Work in America. And this is one of those big studies, sort of like Gunnar Myrdal's American Dilemma, a really big study with lots of academics, lots of practitioners, lots of meetings and people, and it's a big report. And it basically is saying, well, here's when it says, all authority in our society is being challenged. Professional athletes challenge owners, journalists challenge editors, consumers challenge manufacturers, and young blue-collar workers who have grown up in an environment in which equality is called for in all institutions are demanding the same rights and expressing the same values as university students. And this is 1972. Now, this, and I think they captured a mood in the American working class at that time. Now, what happens, of course, and this is totally another story, when we get recessions and destruction of the industrial Midwest, I mean, this kind of radical sensibility, is dampened for sure. And that happens by the late 70s. But it was there, and no doubt about it. I think it's now forgotten, but it was definitely there. And I think this effort by new leftists, now out of school and in the professions, to radicalize the leading institutions of American civic culture, the universities, newspapers, TV, Hollywood, advertising, mainstream Protestant churches, even the Boy Scouts and the women's clubs, created a backlash. Not from evangelicals or working class hard hats, so it was there, that's true, or even the Republican Party. But the backlash came from a thin but highly influential strata of older liberal intellectuals who had made their peace with American culture and the main currents of American liberal politics. These were people who'd be called neoconservatives. They'd been New Dealers, they'd been for the civil rights movement, they'd been for the welfare state, but they could not abide this new left effort to radicalize their institutions, i.e. the university, the newspapers, the journals, and the term they applied to this new left world of the professionals, they were infused with the adversary culture, which was a very negative from their point of view. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who would become senator from New York, who then worked for Richard Nixon, he wrote to Nixon, he said to Nixon, a new class of intellectuals, all those tasked with manipulating language, the humanists and social scientists, has turned their backs on society to which they owe their high-ranking status. He said, no doubt there is a struggle going on in this country of the kind the Germans used to call Kulturkampf. That is a clash of cultures. The adversary culture which dominates almost all channels of information transfer and opinion formation has never been stronger. And as best as I can tell, it has come near silencing the representatives of traditional America. Now, they had a theory, the neoconservatives, they had a theory. They thought that this new class, which Ehrenreich could call the professional managerial class, which, we're going to radicalize the institutions. They thought, this is just, I remember this. This was what was going on in Eastern Europe. This is what's going on in the commissars, in Moscow and in Berlin. And Milovac Gilas, who was a dissident communist in Yugoslavia, wrote a famous book called The New Class in the late 50s, an analysis of the communist system, of the class of the bureaucrats and the cultural commissars. And he was right. He was right about that. But the neoconservatives, the Daniel Patrick Moynahans, the Irving Crystals, they said, well, that's exactly what we have now in the United States. And here, a book that came out, Tenured Radicals. Now, if you don't think that's a criticism, just ask the people on this panel. That's not a praising us, right? That's not okay. Tenured radicals, how politics has corrupted our higher education, and this idea became a very powerful one. This theory that what the new left is, what the radical is of the cultural apparatus is, this is just a new class of wannabe commissars, and watch out for them because they're gonna destroy, they're gonna subvert all that is good and true in American culture. Here's Irving Crystal, who really is he'd been a radical in the 30s and 40s, but by the 70s he's writing for the Wall Street Journal and is one of the major advocates of attacking this so-called new class. Now, what's ironic here is that this so-called new class, I mean, if it had only been as powerful as the neoconservatives thought it would be, it wasn't. And in fact, we have had a proletarianization, that would be the Marxist term, but you could just say the starvation and the increasing inequality which has been going on in American society since the late 1970s. And today, the manifestations that are taking place today, of resistance to that, well, Occupy Wall Street, that was basically, there've been sociological studies of these guys, and they were basically, wannabe professionals, who were stymied. Some of them were professionals, and they occupied Zuccotti Park in downtown New York. And then, of course, something Ellie's working on. Here are these middle class people who want to be part of the middle class who are now being freighted with all this debt, to achieve that. And then finally, of course, the public school strikes that have been taking place recently. I mean, if school teachers were the quintessential, professional managerial, member of that class, maybe not the top of it, but they were there. I mean, school teachers, exercise authority. They transform ideas. And here they had the utter proletarianization of them, and the exploitation has manifest, and they're now at least possibly in revolt. So the new left, this moment, its own conception of itself as a class, it's had a legacy. It's had a legacy both on the right, where it's been demonized by the neoconservatives as a new class that wants to basically transform American society and culture in a negative fashion. And I think on the left, it's clear that what we once thought of as sort of white-collar, middle-class people are now, functioning and acting like blue-collar workers whose livelihoods were undermined by the economic transformations of the 1970s and 80s. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nelson. Our third speaker is Peter Pios, who is an assistant professor of history at Western Washington University. He was educated at Harvard and Penn, and also received his MA and law degrees from NYU, after which he clerked for the Honorable Diane P. Wood of the United States Court of Appeals in the Seventh Circuit. He's also been involved in liberal arts educational alternatives, teaching at Deep Springs College and the Arete Project. His research examines the political struggles over race, crime, and policing, and their role in the legal, political, and social economic transformation of American cities over the last half century. He's particularly interested in the intersection of activism against crime and police brutality and corruption. Peter's forthcoming book, Black Power Through Law, The Afro-American Patrolman's League and the Struggle for Justice, is a revision of his dissertation, which was recognized as an honorable mention for the Michael B. Katz Award for the Best Dissertation in Urban History in 2016. Black Power Through Law challenges popular wisdom about the relationship between crime, policing, and politics during the second half of the 20th century, offering an alternative history of the relationship of fighting crime and police reform. By examining African American police officers, he remaps the relationship between local black movements, the rise of economic austerity, and the expansion of punitive policing. Peter? Thank you.
I got to switch this, right? Thanks. Oh, there we go. Thanks. All right, well, I read David's book, and I didn't know what his talk was going to be about, so I was pleasantly surprised to see how some of our ideas about the meaning of 68 actually dovetail. So, I wanted to get into this by showing some example of the way in which the phrase Chicago in 1968 conjures up a certain strata of people, mainly, white, young protesters facing off against the police. So I just did a Google search. Of course, we know these algorithms are personalized, so there are actually a few more black people in my Google search than there might be in other people's. And so what I want to talk about today is how, even if on the surface, black people seem absent from the history of the Democratic Convention and from the main story of 68, we can actually find the ways in which they're quite present here. And so I kind of have two arguments that I'd like to make to you. The first is that police behavior at the 1968 convention had everything to do with the question of the relationship between African Americans in Chicago and the police department. And here I'm building on some work that David did in his book. And the second is that I want to go beyond the police rioting at the convention to argue that on the terrain of local politics, law and order was met with an equally powerful grassroots political movement during the 1970s to democratize and control the police. So this is where I'm agreeing with David, which is that contrary to the notion that Chicago 68 led to a fracturing of American politics, on the local level it opened up new spaces for political coalitions in which a broad range of liberal and left, nationalist and integrationist forces were able to collaborate during the 1970s. Okay, so to my first argument. So what I want to say here is between 1960 and 1968, the Chicago Police Department underwent two fundamental shifts in terms of its relationship to black Chicagoans. So first, in 1960, it turned to a policy of liberal incorporation, and I'll say more about that in a second. And then the second is that in the middle of the decade, it turned to kind of a grassroots-inflected form of law and order, what I call the Blue Rebellion. And this is what we see in evidence at the convention in 68. Okay, so what's this liberal incorporation? Well, the first thing to know is that throughout the 20th century, Chicago's police had more black officers than almost any other police force in the country. Often it did have the most. And this was a reflection of the place of African Americans in Chicago politics throughout the 20th century. They were well incorporated into the competing partisan political machine. So here you see, the percentage of black officers falls, about half of the percentage of the black population for most of the 20th century. But in comparison to New York, Philadelphia, Detroit, et cetera, these numbers are generally much higher. Okay, so during the Daley regime, here's a picture of Mayor Daley with some of his key black lieutenants. I want to stress that this incorporation of African Americans into Chicago politics continued
and that black voters and Mayor Daley's black allies were really quite important to his election in 1955, critical, as well as in 1959 and in 1963. So African Americans formed this key component of Mayor Daley's Democratic machine through the mid-60s. And so when Mayor Daley was faced with racial controversies such as, civil rights protests in 1963 and then again in 65, 66, it was often these guys in this picture, his black allies, who would be the face of the Daley machine, facing off with civil rights protesters. This translated into the police department. So in 1960, there was a huge scandal in the police department, and Mayor Daley decided to undertake, large-scale reform of the department. He hired an egghead from Berkeley, we have a couple here, to, really ensure that the police department, both to assert his own authority of it, but also to reform it along professional lines. In this reform, opening pathways to black advancement was an integral, if somewhat ambivalent, part of what happened. So the police actively recruited black candidates. By 1961, nearly 25% of new hires were black, and that was almost matched perfectly the proportion of the black working age males in the labor force. And it also offered a commitment to fighting police brutality. So this is just one example, a memo sent by the superintendent, who's the guy in the corner, in 1964. So this memo just touts, the fair and impartial, the department's commitment to the fair and impartial enforcement of the law in dealing with civil rights demonstrations. In the memo, he acknowledges the wrongness of police brutality, and also, and this is the language right at the end, he really highlights the way in which claims of police brutality are rooted in status hierarchies, in the relationship between white police officers and the African Americans that they're often policing. Yet at the same time, the memo kind of is skeptical about police brutality. It frames brutality claims as, quote, frequently publicized allegations of brutality in the Negro press. And later on, it goes on to say that most complaints of brutality arise out of instances where the complainant has resisted arrest, and so therefore the police are forced to use force. So we have this kind of, ambivalent embrace of stopping brutality. But along with this, we get an embrace of more aggressive policing tactics in the 1960s. So police are sent out to proactively deter crime, or at least this is the theory, and this really exacerbates conflict with black Chicagoans. So in this overall picture, what I argue is that racial integration comes to operate as a tactic by which the police hierarchy tries to diffuse tension over the police practices that it's putting into place. So just one example, in the summer of 1965, which is kind of the first of the long hot summers, the police superintendent purposefully puts at the head of all 5 black precincts black commanders. This is so that when African Americans are angry about police treatment, they come face to face with a black commander, right? And the behavior of these commanders is shaped by their institutional affiliation. So in 1966, when one of them, is approached by black nationalists who tell him, our activities in the neighborhood are going to be, hinge on your performance as a black man, he responds that enforcing the laws and protecting the community citizens is his job as a policeman, not as a Negro. Okay, so that's the first paradigm, sort of liberal integrationism. And this brings us to the Blue Power Rebellion in the mid-1960s. So what we have here is civil rights reform, growing black militancy, a rising homicide rate, inspire a grassroots law and order backlash amongst the police rank and file. And this backlash, this Blue Rebellion, finds a lot of sympathy in City Hall. So one piece of evidence that reform was over is that these earlier efforts in 1960 through 1964 to hire more black officers go totally out the window. By 1964, hiring of black officers start to plummet. By the early 1970s, it's down to 10%. even as the population of blacks in the city of Chicago starts approaching 30%. And this reassertion of a white hold on police jobs kind of matches a broader claim of authority in constituting the urban order. So at its heart, this Blue Power Rebellion asks actually the same question that the Black Power Rebellion of the 1960s and 70s asked, which is, who is to control the nation's police forces? Is it the police themselves, or is it the community? Obviously, they give very different answers. So Mayor Daley kind of embraces this Blue Power Rebellion, and I think this is confirmed in his response to the uprising that followed the death of Martin Luther King in Memphis on April 4th of 1968. As David mentioned, this was pretty devastating for the west side of Chicago. During the 48 hours of major unrest, over 260 stores and businesses were burned. This occurred mostly along Madison Street in East Garfield Park and then down on Roosevelt Road in North Lawndale. And so most accounts of this uprising kind of say that the police handled it in a reasonably hands-off manner, and that this enraged Mayor Daley. But I think there should be some revision to this. So 3 kind of points about aggressive police intervention. I mean, one is just like, as David mentioned, there was some marching by students after school, and there was kind of spotted destruction actually in a bunch of different areas of the city, on the south side, in Cabrini Green, as well as on the west side on the 4th and 5th. And it's not until this march gets turned back on the way to Austin High School by this one particular notorious and corrupt police officer named Mark Thanasouris, who fires his gun into the air, that the major destruction begins. So it's as this march gets turned around that the character of it really changes. The second thing that I think is important is that on April 6th and 7th, the first night there weren't a lot of arrests made, but by the second and third day, there's more than 2,000 people arrested. And it's just, noting in comparison to the convention, this is almost 3 times as many arrests as are made in August of 1968. And then finally, police kill 4 people and shoot another 48, including hundreds more who are injured. And again, these numbers aren't totally conclusive in comparison to the convention, because it's a bit hard to get a handle on how many people actually were injured in August. But at the least, one of the books about the convention is called No One Is Killed. So we do have this contrast. So the mayor's response to this shooting, which is one of the most famous statements to ever attach, occurred to the mayor, and that attached to his kind of history and legacy, occurred on April 15th. And here, the Chicago Sun-Times had run a story that kind of raised a few oblique questions about these 4 deaths at the hands of the police. And in trying to explain them, the reporter quoted the officers saying, quote, "No blanket orders pertaining to firing were issued, and we were told to use our own judgment." So it's in response to kind of hearing through the newspaper that the officers were told to use their own judgment, that Daley calls this famous press conference where he gives his famous syntactically garbled statement that he's ordered the police superintendent to issue an order to shoot to kill any arsonists or anyone with a Molotov cocktail in his hand, and to shoot to maim or cripple any arsonists and looters, arsonists to kill and looters to maim and cripple. So police behavior at the convention, as David argues, has to be seen in light of the events of April of 1968 and of the permission given to police officers to control public space following the April uprisings. Okay, so this brings me to my second argument, which is that the Blue Power Rebellion, which is symbolized by the response to the April uprising, by the response at the Democratic Convention in August, and by the killing of Fred Hampton in 1969 in a very sensational police murder, all together catalyzed a grassroots political movement around police violence that really crossed some of the narrow political lines that divided Chicagoans. And my work centers on a group of dissident black police officers who emerged around this time called the Afro-American Patrolmen's League. So all of these guys are hired right at the tail end of this movement for liberal integration that I talked about earlier. And in the months before the King riots, so in late 1967 and early 1968, they start to meet, to talk about what they feel is discrimination at work. And as they talk more about this, and actually in their kind of deliberations, they're spurred on by this black Catholic priest who's going through similar struggles within the hierarchy of the Chicago diocese at this time. They really start to turn their attention to bigger issues. What is our role as police officers? How are we shaping the social order in which African Americans exist? And so Daley's shoot-to-kill order is really a catalyst for them, and it moves them from their basement meetings out into open opposition to the mayor. So in June, they announce that they've formed this organization, and they issue a statement to the press. And I just want to highlight a couple of things about the statement. So the first thing is that it calls out the existing police associations that, like the Fraternal Order of Police, for supporting stop and frisk and the shoot to kill and maim looters. So what we see is that they are really locating themselves against this blue rebellion and articulating their role as black policemen in opposition to the way in which their brother officers have constituted themselves. And the second thing I want to point our attention to is just the way in which this statement, albeit in sort of a paternalistic way, really is interested in kind of drawing effective lines of attachment. So it's really, picking up on currents that are running through Black Power that seek to really say that black policemen and black people have some set of common interests that they should be effectuating. And so this is where the League really takes off from. Okay, so the League reacts to the convention violence in August of 1968 by linking it back to the April uprising. And I just want to quote a little bit of what one officer, Willie Ware, told Chicago's black newspaper, The Defender. He said, in the uproar over the events on Michigan Avenue, people failed to recognize that black people have been beaten and killed for years. The only difference between that incident and the disturbances on the West Side is color. So as David alluded to, the kind of sad irony of national polling. So just to explain that a little more, and this reaction is very common across strata, from national figures to local figures. There's a great scene in the documentary American Revolution 2, if any of you have seen it, where they talk about, we're in a pool hall where the guys are talking about their feelings about the Democratic Convention. And far and wide, black people say, well, people only notice police brutality now because it's happening to these young white kids. The irony of this is, of course, what David said, which is that in this national opinion polling following the convention, actually the only people who were more likely than not to be upset about the police brutality at the convention were African Americans. It wasn't whites. The only category of whites who were more likely than not to be upset were people under the age of 40 who possess graduate degrees, I believe. So maybe this fits in, Nelson, with what you're saying as well. So police brutality, we see in that polling, unites this wide spectrum of black public opinion. And, this may seem to us to be unexceptional, but I think the way it plays out in local politics is quite extraordinary. One of the reasons that I have chosen to focus on the Afro-American Patrolmen's League is because they represent something that I think is really unexpected, which is kind of a militant faction found inside the very state power that it's opposing. So we have often a lot of assumptions about black politics that kind of take off from the Jim Crow era, where we kind of think, oh, black people have a discrete political subjectivity and they're likely to feel in the same ways about political issues. But I think the history of black politics in Chicago and the history of people like the AAPL is interesting for showing us that black people can inhabit many different political subjectivities depending on, how their material interests are aligned in relationship to power. So what's extraordinary about this moment in 1968 and thereafter is the way in which it allows Black Chicagoans to kind of realign their subjectivities and to form a political coalition around this particular question of police brutality. And so this involves, and what makes it, I think, different than some earlier moments in Chicago is that it involves people who are inside the political system as well as people who are outside of it. So this is the kind of pragmatic organizing that I think David was talking about. So as the League worked to oppose police brutality, they worked with lots of other folks. So this included outsiders like the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, emerging gay rights groups who were also opposed to police raids on gay bars. And as historians have written about each of these organizations, they've really focused on how coalition building occurred really after 1968 around fighting the question of police harassment and brutality. But there's also lots of older liberal organizations that join in on this. So the ACLU, for example, starts in 1969 something called the Ghetto Law Project, where they work on a lot of these questions. The Chicago Urban League, which had been focused mainly on jobs, makes this huge pivot in the late 1960s towards criminal justice issues. A whole new network of organizations forms in Chicago: the Alliance to End Repression, Citizens Alert, the Chicago Law Enforcement Study Group, all of which, again, are really focused on these questions of criminal justice. And what this ultimately provides is a transformed landscape in which Black political figures attached to the Daley machine are faced with a choice of who they want to ally with. And so we see in the early 1970s some of Daley's key Black lieutenants actually breaking away from him over the question of police brutality. The most famous of these is a guy named Ralph Metcalf, who super interesting figure. So all of that is to say, the events of 1968 provided this vivid demonstration of how the police had turned to law and order, and this in turn provided a foundation for building broad-based local grassroots politics against police brutality and for democratic control. Okay, so this is a conference on Global 68. These epical events in which kind of fireworks, of radicalism shine light on these sharp social divisions, and revolutionary movements run aground against these powerful forces, be they Soviet, Priista, or the blue helmets of the Chicago police. So, in comparison to these epical conflicts, it feels sometimes as though this kind of history that I'm telling is quite local and small bore. And to kind of double down on that, from the perspective of today, it's worrisome, right? Because we can see in our contemporary news these issues that were bouncing around in 1969 and 70 really failed to liberate Black communities and instead have led to more widespread and discriminatory forms of capture. So, it always leaves me at the question of why bother to tell this kind of local history at all, right? What is the point of this in the face of what seems like such reactionary change? So I want to offer two things in closing on that point. So the first is that if we ignore these people, if we ignore their efforts to remake the city of Chicago, we replicate the failings of American politics, which has starved many Black urban places of resources, attention, and, too many narratives other than ones of decline. So showing that these robust social movements continue to build on the ruins of 68 should force us to ask other questions about why they withered, why they failed to end police brutality. And this dovetails with Nelson somewhat in that I think we need to look at the political economy and the institutional context in which these activists operated to understand failing, not as failings of their movements, but of the particular conditions that they confronted. And this connects to my second point, which is we can't really answer the question of how we ended up where we are today by just looking at 1968. Criminal justice politics actually remained quite open through the 1970s, at least in my belief, in contrast to a lot of books that are coming out today. And I think we really need to look and find the moments at which the state and federal government turn to fully starving the cities within this changed political economy. Did the possibilities open to local activists really fully decline? So we really need to come to grips to how politics in different jurisdictions shaped each other and the possibilities for change. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. I think we have time for a few questions, so I'd like to open it up to the audience. Yes.
Well, I certainly enjoyed hearing about Chicago in 1968 and remembering. So, you know, my husband and I were obviously here. I have to share that I was a young patriot in 1972 and signed the lease for our clinic on Wilson Avenue. So I remember some of this stuff, so it's extremely interesting to me. The only thing you all have not said too much about is the influence of the war in Vietnam on radicalizing people. And so I'm also a veteran and, you know, was overseas, you know, in 68 to 71, and I think that had a profound influence on working class people because that's who was drafted, and also on African Americans and other people of color. And so it's interesting to hear about what white radicals thought, but what about all the people who went to Vietnam? Because that was certainly a radicalizing experience, in my opinion. And yeah, we were there like for the Tet Offensive, so.
Any of you want to respond to that?
I'd like to respond by asking you to follow up a little bit. So you came back, and you came back to Chicago, I take it, after your
Right.
service. What do you think the atmosphere was among veterans from the working class that you mixed with and met afterward? I mean, what
Well,
was
you know, I will say that I don't think I was typical. I'm a Loyola graduate and I'm a nurse. So my experience, you know, was being nursing. So when we came back, a lot of us who had that experience wanted to do good. So we opened free clinics and we became involved in that way. But there were certainly many, you know, working class, you know, people who also joined that. So, yeah, and I guess what I mostly remember is how much the city of Chicago did not like the free clinics. And so they made a huge effort to co-opt the free clinic movement. And the last thing I'll say is one of my colleagues, Judy Scully, who ended up on the board at Loyola, was a young lord. But we were healthcare providers in those clinics. We were not organizers of it. And so one of the fun things that happened maybe it's about 20 years ago, we went to a meeting at Cook County Department of Public Health, and sitting around the table were all us aging people, and we said, hey, I recognize you, and wait, didn't you run that clinic? And so we all sort of stayed in healthcare, and I'm still running a free clinic, and it's 50 years later. So.
You know, one of the things I would like to follow up on is there's a kind of myth, and it's a really pernicious myth, that somehow, pick a year, 1973, anybody who'd been in the New Left or a lot of African-American radicals suddenly became yuppies, or they copped out, or they sold their birthright for a bowl of porridge. And I think your example is wonderful and not unique. I've been interviewing all sorts of people here in Chicago who were very active in Rising Up Angry, which is very much, it sounds like your world. And this is a group that came out of Uptown and was involved with the Young Patriots and others. And these are the people who, as you say, and some of it goes to what Nelson was saying, these are people who said, I'm going to stick it out. I'm going to get into, public health was a classic place for it. Social work was another classic place. A lot of city services. And you see people, but also going into legal clinics. And there's just a whole wild infrastructure that was racially integrated, that grew up in the 1970s in Chicago, not the 1960s. And I think in some ways the 1970s were a more radical period in the city of Chicago, but again, not in that kind of marching in the streets, but in actually creating alternative institutions and radical factions within organizations, which is what Nelson was talking about. And it's really kind of this wild, unsung story. And progressivism, I think, dug deep and went local. as much as anything. And I think we're still kind of trying to figure that out. And when you look at a guy like Barack Obama, who comes to the city much later, and he's a young guy, and he kind of stumbles in this world, and he actually stumbles is the right word, because he doesn't even realize that there's this whole progressive world that he's wandered into. And so when he tries to take on Bobby Rush, Chicago's progressive class are like, dude, who are you? You know, make your bones before you do this. And Rush beats him badly. And Obama says, I screwed up. And then he digs deep. And he tries to become a rooted progressive. And, you know, it's the story of the left we never hear. It didn't disappear. It didn't lose. It just transformed. And, you know, I think that's what Nelson was getting at, what you're telling us about in the 70s. And it's just, you know, thank you for witnessing to us. Appreciate it.
Just the other thing that I would follow up is I do think, I mean, one of the reasons I have at times avoided Chicago 68 kind of as a topic is because I think seeing the anti-war movement in certain public formations is very much distorts our historical memory of who exactly was anti-war. So if you look at public opinion polling, for example, African Americans are consistently more anti-war than any other demographic, right? And this in the mid to late 60s really accelerates to the point where 70 to 80% of African Americans polled think that we've taken the wrong course in Vietnam.
So are old white working class people, are the other demographic that's very opposed to the war in Vietnam.
So it distorts when we only see anti-war activism through sort of public confrontations like Chicago 68. It just distorts what public feeling, who was anti-war.
I will say one more thing about the anti-war movement I think is really important. I think it did drive people crazy in the way that like was a moral craziness. So like if it's 1968 and you're watching what's happening in Vietnam and you're like really conscious of what American planes are starting to do in 69, it's much worse even. Like it could drive you crazy. Like what are we doing? We're killing people in massive numbers. And so I think what I see sometimes seeing as the lunacy of the left, like 1969 and 70, there's elements of the left that, you know, they're dreaming of revolutionary radicalism in sync with the Chinese and the North Koreans. You know, this is crazy stuff. But they've been driven crazy by the war in Vietnam. So I look at it, I call it the John Brown moment. Like, what the hell are you supposed to do when you're looking at this? And you're like really conscious of it's like, this is being done in my name. It's hard not to be driven a little crazy. You know, I think it was a dead end politically, but you have to, the war was just such a powerful force in people's lives. And, you know, it was horrible.
Yes?
Yeah, no, thank you all three for your presentations. I did just see a book that was called The Global 60s and the Subversive 70s. And so that maybe that gets to your point about the 1970s. There's a lot to say. One of the things about, I teach on the 1960s, and recently it just came out, I think maybe a couple weeks ago, that these declassified documents that General Westmoreland, along with the Chief Admiral of Pacific Forces of the United States, had green-lighted a plan in February of 1968 to place nuclear weapons in South Vietnam because they were losing the war. Or they were losing a battle, excuse me. They were losing one battle. And so what was great about this article is it was declassified documents that were declassified in 2016, and a historian working on presidential decision-making found it as he was looking at LBJ, who had, after about a week, canceled this operation that had already been approved by the commander of Pacific Forces. And I brought the declassified documents to my students. We talked about, you know, what would these, why were these documents kept secret? What would have been the outcome? And one of my students said, well, it would have proved the anti-war movement right if the public would have heard that nuclear weapons were planned to be placed in South Vietnam because of a battle. And I mean, I try to use scholarly language with my students, but the fact that these generals were also considering using strategic nuclear weapons because they were losing one battle also seemed like crazy town, right? Like what's going on among the top generals in Vietnam also seems a bit crazy. And so I was kind of thinking about that as you all were speaking. I think one of the things we challenge, or the challenge of 68 is that, and the challenge of contemporary history is that, so we have people who lived through 1968, for better or worse, in terms of their own narratives, right? So some people tell us narratives about 1968 that are important, I think that maybe are kind of progressive ones. There are other ones that they tell certain narratives and then people react to that, right? I have colleagues who are like, I hate the boomers. I hate everything they stand for, right? There's all this stuff. And so there's a kind of challenge about how to both reckon with the legacy, but then also study the moments of potential in 1968 or in the 1960s. And I don't know, that's something I struggle with. I was wondering how you all do that, in that the legacy matters and what the 60s has bequeathed us matters, but also is there a way that we can hold on to these moments of potential? Peter, some of the people that you were describing, right? Like that this is maybe if they get eclipsed by other historical trends, it's worth us as historians trying to capture those moments.
Let me say one. Can you hear me? When we're on this question, the Vietnam War unquestionably is a radicalizing event that has a huge impact on a whole generation. And both, many people. And by 68, though, you're getting a situation where the left, and this is not just the white left, black left as well, and Latino left certainly, has sort of transcended the specifics of, anti-Vietnam. Of course it's like, of course we want the war to end, but it's far more than that. I mean, and this, you mentioned, yes, you have, sort of pseudo-Bolshevik, extremism, but everything else, the discussion of revolution, which, now as historians we see this, come on, this is the United States, I mean, we know this, but nevertheless, that took on a kind of plausibility, and I think it's transcended by 68, 67, 68, and certainly 69, it's transcended Vietnam. Although the war is still going on, I mean, it's, the mendacity is still there. But if you're dealing with, what is motivating kind of that sector of the population that's most active. So that's one thing. The other thing, which we didn't mention here, but there have been books written about this, a very large plurality, or perhaps a majority of, white working class people, wanted to get out of Vietnam by the late 60s, but they also equally, even more so, hated the New Left, hated the anti-war demonstrators, and that's a fact that how to grapple with that, and I think it reflects certainly the perceptions of class that are both from below and from above, and that's clearly the case, and I'm sure that's manifested itself in Chicago, that's for sure.
Mike?
Oh, sorry.
How about one last question? Can we have one last question?
I think it could be brief if we're quite past the floor. Yeah, of course.
Never mind.
Yeah, but make it brief.
You have to answer it. The question that I have for all of you is that, so I think that we would have heard similar things about thinking about where we can see what we would call contemporary progressivism 50 years later. We'd hear this if we were doing 40 years since 68. We hear this in 2008 after the election of Barack Obama. But would you have said this if we were doing maybe the 35th anniversary of 1968 in the midst of the Bush administration, about where was that this idea about what came out at the local level forward, and also especially since Nelson ended with the teachers' strikes, we could talk in the Midwestern case about the Chicago Teachers Union is again after that Obama moment and all this other kind of and all that kind of stuff. So my question is how much is it that we're finally being able to see what was built out of that? Because 40 years later, it's kind of, it did look dormant for so long because we weren't looking at the local level. You don't have to answer that, but it's just a thought. And I include that with also the efforts to reform the police around the country, not just in the city of Chicago.
Okay, applause here for our panel, so thank you very much.